Welcome to another episode of the Empowered Half Hour, and I am so honored to bring you a New World Library friend and fellow author, Scott Stabile. And Scott, I am so happy to have you here, but when I was reading your bio before you coming on, I saw that you go by Love Advocate. You're a love advocate. I think that's so cool. Welcome.
But hey, thank you. I think that's so cool too. Is actually started as love activist, which is something that a title a friend bestowed on me. And when people would ask me what I do, I would always just stumble through the response. Like I do some writing and I lead workshops, and it was always this long-winded stutter through what I do. And then I'm like, I'm a love activist. Not that that's clear for people, and you still have to explain it, but I do feel like that speaks to someone who makes a lot of noise for the power of love in our lives.
Oh, that's really awesome. Yeah, I'm a big fan of love too. So,
Yeah,
one of my colleagues coined something different but similar. She says, "You're like an awakening agent." And I was like, "Ooh, I like
beautiful.
that."
I like that too. Alliteration. Yeah.
So, we got some coin names going on. Well, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have today's conversation. You recently released a book, Enough as You Are. And for the listeners out there, I would really encourage you to pick it up because I know most of you are busy because I attract who I am. So this book has lots of short little phrases and paragraphs that are empowering, insightful, motivating, reflective. I mean, I really enjoyed getting into this. But Scott, let's get into the conversation. Let's tell the audience a little bit about your background. How did you get to a point of wanting to write Enough as You Are?
Well, enough as you are, in a way, I've been writing it for the past many years because it's kind of a collection of different writings that I've shared over many years, along with some new writings to make it feel fresh. So, though it'll feel fresh to you if you don't know who I am, I promise. And I think Becca, for me, as I've moved through my life, and it started in my 20s, I really started to connect with this inner knowing that love is really just an energy that is alive within us and outside of us. It's an energy that we get to choose how much we want to play with it and use it and act from that place. And when I talk about love, I'm talking about everything love embodies, like compassion, forgiveness, kindness, empathy, all of these juicy energies, right? That we feel most alive when we are giving and receiving them. And I started to notice in my 20s, well, what if it came through? Like, the longer version of what I'm about to say is I got involved with a cult in the Bay Area and found a
Oh no.
guru and became a disciple to a guru for many years. And that ended in a very difficult, kind of ugly way. But while I was in that community, love was really foundational to everything we were talking about and how we were being and what we were learning. And I do say learning because I think love is something everyone's talking about it so often. And yet we don't really grow up with a learning around it, which is to say, this understanding that is within our power to choose love in our
Yeah.
thoughts, in our words, in our actions. Certainly in our words and actions, our thoughts oftentimes are beyond our control. We're thinking without being aware of what we're thinking. But the moment we have awareness, we can start to reframe or shift everything we're doing through the lens of love. And not from a place of denial, to be clear, not from a place of not being honest about how we're feeling and honest about what's happening in the world, but from this knowing that whenever I'm aligned with love, I feel better in my being. I'm speaking for myself. I feel most at home in my being. And when I'm bringing awareness to how I'm feeling and shift my energy back to love and then check in with this renewed sense of alignment, it's just constant motivation to consider, well, what is love inviting me to do right now? How might love shift how I'm showing up for this moment or this situation? And so I've been playing with that for a lot of my life. And to be clear, I'm not always loving. I fall off the love train plenty. I've just gotten really good at getting myself back into alignment with love in a way that allows me to be in better relationship with myself and with others.
Yeah. There's so much that you're talking about that I could probably go in like three or four different directions with. But one thing that really resonated for me as you were saying that is Well, two things. One, I'm a Kundalini yoga teacher, so very much so people considered that a cult at some points during its duration, but so I can relate to some of the weird stuff that
Sure.
goes on. But at the foundation of it, though, I would say with the Kundalini yoga that, love, and I use the word radiance a lot in my work, but those things are a natural extension of us. They're always present. Our
Yeah.
gifts, our talents, our love, our ability to serve, and doing those things from a place of wholeness and alignment is really available. And I think that's kind of mind blowing to people because we spend so much time and money trying to fix ourselves and to,
Yeah.
I don't know, connect with people in ways. And when you allow yourself to go deeper within, you do connect with love and you do connect with your gifts and your talents. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Thank you.
The other thing that came up for me was I lost both my parents early in my adult years. I lost my mom
Okay.
at 22 and I lost my dad when I was 36. And then my parents were really cool people. They were full-time musicians when I was born and was raised in kind of like that love. I mean, they were totally like the hippies, sex, drugs, rock and roll type of thing. And it was, well, I wouldn't say drugs. That's not fair. Like peace, love, happiness. There you go, mom and dad.
Okay.
But they
All
were
right.
all six of those things. So, anyways, my point is that unfortunately for me, they did pass away from complications with prescription drugs, and each of them in their own unique path. And so for many years, I found it hard to be compassionate towards them. I felt like their actions were reckless and it left me and my brother orphaned. And I had a lot of anger around it.
Sure.
It took years of work. But when I'm tying it back to your message, though, when I finally let love in, and I like the big love, like capital L love, I felt my whole energy around it shift, my whole perception around it shift. And all of a
Hmm.
sudden, I saw them as, two individual people that were doing the best that they can. And that unfortunately, they didn't have the handbook to life. Work, bills, responsibility overwhelmed them. That's what they turned to. It wasn't self destructive, actually. It was just that they didn't know how to cope. And so my compassion grew is where I'm going. And that
Yeah.
is when you can open up to love and you can open up to compassion, you get to see things in different light. So I don't know if you'd like to maybe dive into that deeper for the listeners so that they can understand how compassion can work.
Yeah, and also, Rebecca, what you're speaking to, I feel, is empathy and the power of empathy,
Yeah.
which is really, it can be very hard. I don't think forgiveness is something we just call out of the sky. You don't just choose forgiveness and then suddenly you've forgiven people. That's never been my experience with it. It can take a bit more work, a bit more time to get to that place. But for me, when I look at the times I've forgiven when it's been most difficult to do, it's been through the path of empathy every single time. Because for me, and what that means is a willingness to really imagine what it might have been like to be in the shoes of another, which is what you're speaking to. You, with your compassionate heart, taking the time to acknowledge, yes, they were my parents, and yes, they had a responsibility as my parents, and they were also just human beings trying to
Yes.
survive and make sense of this world in the same way that we all are. How might their journey have been for them that had them showing up in this way that they showed up, that ultimately was really hurtful and damaging in different ways to me as their child? And every time I take the time and put the energy into empathy and really considering the humanity and the lived experience in another person, it allows me to show up for them with more compassion. It just naturally opens my heart to them as not just a parent, not just one title, but as a human being. When I lost my parents at a
Yes.
very young age, I lost them at 14. They were shot to
Wow.
death in Detroit. And I had a very really damaging relationship with my father prior to his death. I felt wholly unloved and unnoticed by him and given no attention. And I had to deal with all my own stuff around their murder,
Yes.
certainly. But I also had to deal
Sure.
with, and that took up a lot of my healing journey. And then it was also looking at the difficulty of growing up and feeling unloved by my father and the toll that took on me and the wound that that created. And I'm going to share something that I wouldn't normally share. I don't know if this is out there for your listeners, but I guide this transformational breathwork practice. And while I was training for it, in the training to become a facilitator,
Uh-huh.
we're going through lots of breath work. And in one of these sessions, my father came to me. And I'm not someone who's
Oh,
ever tapped into past loved ones or had like medium energy awaken in me. But in this session, my father came to me and said to me very clearly, he was like standing at my feet, and he said to me, "Where I am now, I am in just joy and bliss." He said, "I'm not carrying any of the wounds that I carried in my human form." And he
yeah.
said, "Scott, I know you carry a big wound in our relationship, that you've carried that through your life. And I want you to know two things. One is that you don't have to wait to transition for that wound to heal. You don't have to wait like I did to enter this place of peace and love. And two, he said, our relationship doesn't have to be over. I know you think it's over, but
Oh,
I'm here and I've always been here. And I'm so excited that you're finally aware of my energy, and my energy is available to you." And it was this profound healing on all ways. This was probably almost 2 years ago now. And it's not that I
oh,
don't
wow.
connect to the wound of feeling like I've never had a father in my life. That still is painful, but I don't connect to my father through his place in creating that wound in the same way. It's like that hole around the pain with him, it just evaporated in that moment. And I've never been able to connect to it in the same way. And it's been one of the greatest gifts of my life, honestly.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story because I've had a similar encounter or two. And I really just want to say for the listeners, especially if you have had severe losses and stuff, like there's messages in our conversation right now that empathy, compassion, and even connection to your loved one is possible. And even if you don't have an experience like Scott and I had, but there's ways to heal. And another area that I'd like to go into before I ask you a new question is space. The internal space that opens up when you have that profound healing or you switch from anger to empathy. Because I feel like for me, that internal space that opened up, I felt like I could breathe, that the weights lifted off. Like I felt different in
Yeah.
my body. And I don't know if you'd be okay speaking about that, but I'd love the listeners to learn a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I'll speak about it in terms of my relationship with the man who killed my parents, because that was all I felt
Oof.
was rage at the time, and vengeful thinking and wanting him dead and all of these things you might imagine a 14-year-old boy feeling about a man
Sure.
who killed your parents. And then in my early 20s, as I started to awaken to love and I'd check in with myself and I would think of this man, it was still with all this rage, and it felt so toxic in my being and so suffocating in my being. And I told myself, you've got to find a way to forgiveness. Like, you don't want to live like this anymore. And this is, I'm going to speaking to what you're asking now. It's what I decided I needed to do with this man was connect to him beyond him being just a killer. And so in my heart, I was like imagining who might he be without knowing his full story. And what I imagined through empathy was, this is a person who feels incredibly lost, incredibly lonely, incredibly angry, incredibly unloved, incredibly confused, because I could only imagine that someone who would choose to take another person's life in that way had to feel some version of all of these things. And when I imagined that, what I felt inside of myself is that I am also lost and confused and angry and lonely and feel unloved and feel unseen. And even the violence, which I thought, well, I can't relate to the violence. I'm like, you've been imagining this man dying horrible deaths for years. Even the violence you could
Yes.
relate to if you're honest with yourselves. Our minds are incredibly violent, or can be. And
Yes.
suddenly he became another human being. Suddenly I was connecting to him as another brother on this planet. And it opened my heart entirely to more compassion. And then I was realizing, when I think of this man, it's with love in my heart. And then what I had realized is, when I think of this man, I'm not holding on to any of the toxic tether I felt to him when I wanted him dead and was hateful. I have completely forgiven him. And as you were speaking to the space that cleared up in my being, it was like
Yeah.
so much more room just to love and breathe and be, because I was no longer holding on to any of the toxic hatred for a human being that I'd been carrying in my body and in my mind and in my being. So there's no saying what choosing love can create in our lives, emotionally, physically, spiritually. It is a pure positive force. The act of love is always an act of service. You are always being of service when you're choosing to show up with compassion and love for another. And the gifts, the beautiful thing about it is it always transcends self. It's always the biggest gift to the self. First, if I'm in love, if I'm acting in love, I'm always serving myself first and foremost. But love is so beautiful and so powerful, it is never limited to self at the same time. It is always in service
Yeah.
to the world.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that too, because I think when we go through our journey, and you can say, I'll speak in the eye, like I needed to heal. I was desperate. I was going through a lot of anger and depression. So I found my way to spirituality and meditation, and then to a point where I went through a series of certifications and things too. But what I didn't expect is through doing the work, how much of that toxicity would release from my being. And what I mean by that too, for you guys, the listeners, is that how Scott was saying, we start ruminating on things. You don't realize how much you really think about something. You're like, oh, I
Mhm.
don't think about it that much.
Yeah.
And then when it's gone, you're like, oh, wow, thank God that got transmuted and is out and healed and whatever, because you're like, you can connect with people. I find myself much more lighthearted, loving, kind, patient, like all those qualities that we all love. But I wasn't expecting to have all those things. I just wanted to feel better. And I mean, I did, but I really like that you shared in detail kind of some of the benefits that happen when you do the work.
Absolutely. And I guess that one thing I feel called to say also is just because the essence of Enough as You Are, the book, is just no matter where you are in your life and no matter how you're choosing to show up in your life, it is within your power to offer yourself love and compassion and grace. And that is, for me, that has been one of the biggest gifts in my life, is understanding that even if I'm making choices that don't necessarily feel like the healthiest choices, even if I'm lost in a numbing cycle where I'm just staring at Netflix for hours, even if I'm not able to show up with the empathy that I would like to have for my fellow human beings, I am no less worthy in that moment and no less worthy of love in that moment. And when we can start to build our relationship to ourselves in that way and deepen it and understand that our worth is inherent, it's predicated on nothing but being born. That is such a powerful realization. And the freedom you have in your life starts to grow in relation to the depth of love you have for yourself, which is to say, when I know I've got my back, I know I have my back now. I am
Yes.
willing to take more risks. I'm willing to risk failure. I'm willing to risk rejection because I know that on the other side of that, no matter what, I've got my back. I'm not going to be there, or maybe my mind will be there beating me up some if it fails, because I have a self abusive mind like we all do. I don't give it as
Sure.
much attention. I don't give it as much energy, and I don't internalize its thoughts the way I used to, but it's still there telling me, you're lazy, you're stupid, whatever it's saying. But I know deeper than that, that my practice of self love has been so consistent and so committed that there's always going to be a voice within that's saying, you're beautiful, baby. You're so worthy. It's okay. None of
Love
that really
that.
matters. I just feel like, why wouldn't we do everything we can do to foster that voice and deepen that connection, knowing that we're with ourselves 24/7 every day of the year? Like, why wouldn't we make as a priority really becoming our own best friend, knowing that it's possible, and then giving energy to the creation of that reality?
Yeah. I'm really happy that you shared that too, because with the audience here in the Empowered Half Hour too, we have a lot of like high performers, a lot of leaders who are wanting to make impact. And what I find too is even though there's a lot of positive intention in the motives of the listeners, that self abuse, that negative talk is really, I would say the thing with high performers is we all kind of struggle with perfectionism. And with
Sure,
perfectionism comes a very bad inner critic.
sure.
And I love that you shared that we are all inherently worthy and that we, instead of having the inner critic, we could have the inner love advocate, or we deserve to be able to tell ourselves nice things and to give ourselves grace and to try and fail and not have to feel so much guilt and shame around it. So Like, bravo,
Hallelujah.
Christian.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, and also, Becca, for me, part of this journey is really understanding that the inner critic is not going to go anywhere. That is part of being human and having a human mind.
Yeah.
And I'm no longer interested in going to war with it. So in the past, it would be this battle that I was waging with my mind and those self-abusive thoughts. I would believe them, or and if I didn't, I was warring against them. And now for me, it's just getting more and more practiced at bearing witness to my mind without becoming it. We talk about this, I think, in spiritual circles a lot, like bearing witness, becoming the metaphor I love the most for that is becoming the sky and allowing all of my thoughts to be the weather, which is to say that when we recognize how expansive we are as beings energetically, and we open ourselves up to our energy as the sky, just expanding, 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 no matter what noise is playing through our minds, no matter what insanity is happening in the outside world, it's like we are able to hold it with more peace by simply allowing it to be, not needing it to be different, recognizing all human minds are insane. We all have envy. We're all jealous. We're all angry. We're all everything. And what happens when we just allow those parts of ourselves to all have a seat at the table without us needing them to be different, but also without needing to be defined by them?
Scott, that was so dope. I loved everything you said because it's so true. Like, we try to reject these things. And I'm
Yeah.
just going to share, like, for myself, like, I'm an anxious person. I've actually struggled a lot with anxiety. But once I started understanding what you're talking about, I was like, well, anxiety is never going to go away. I can
Mhm.
want it to go away, but it's not going to go away. I can lessen it through meditation and stuff like that. But honestly, I'm a wound up person. So
Uh-huh.
there's just an element to accepting that that's part of my wiring. And what
Yes.
I learned is that anxiety is not bad. And hear me out. What I'm saying is, I accepted that that's a part of my being. And now I align it to my work. I am in high performance sales and software. And I do a lot of project management for like multi-million dollar deals. And that's anxiety, right? You've
Yeah,
got
yeah.
resources and people and big dollar signs and all this stuff, and anxiety gets to do her job. And then by the time I'm done with work, I'm like, in my personal life, I'm like, I'm good.
Yeah,
Like,
I love that.
and I've learned to leverage it as an asset too, and not just something that is quote unquote wrong with me. So I really love what you shared.
Yeah, and why wouldn't you do that? That's the question I'm asking myself all the time when I'm like, why wouldn't I be considering ways to be in relationship with myself that actually feel better than simply miring myself in judgment? And I think so much of our suffering is created less in general, and not always, but it's less about what is the actual experience going on and so much more about how we're judging ourselves within the context of the experience, right? I can eat ice cream like a champ. I can knock out a pint of ice cream, no problem. And I used to judge myself so harshly as I'm eating the ice cream. It's like, you're a pig,
Why am
you're
I doing
stupid,
this?
you're unhealthy, you're not taking care of yourself. And so the misery created around that was not from the eating of the ice cream, it was from the judgment. You get in the practice of
Yes.
removing these shame spirals, and all I'm left with is ice cream, which I love, and that's actually a very joyful experience, right? And we can apply that to
It's a cool
every area of
example.
our lives. It's like, how are we shaming ourselves instead of just allowing for what is happening? And if what is happening is not how we want to be showing up, understanding, hey, it's human, and maybe next time you'll show up a little differently, that is more in line with what you believe to be healthy. But there's no reason ever, in my opinion, to shame ourselves, because I have never shamed myself into healing. And yet I've consistently loved myself into a more relaxed and more connected and better feeling place to be.
I love that. That's really beautiful. So before we wrap up, I knew this conversation was going to go fast, and it's kind of oozed through you throughout the interview. But why are you passionate about this topic and getting out there and sharing your message?
I'm really passionate about love in general and have been for many years. I make a lot of noise for the power of love. I see it as our greatest healer, and without it, healing is not a possibility. There are a lot of change agents out there, but without love, healing does not get created. And then I'm a big, Enough as You Are is a lot about self love and the power of self love and self acceptance. And for me, that is critical because I really see our relationship with ourself as the foundation from which we experience everyone and everything in the world, which is to say, the better relationship I have with myself, the more available I am in a more compassionate way to other people in
Yes.
there out there in the world, the more naturally loving I am with other people. There's that phrase, you can't pour from an empty cup. And that's really what I
Yes.
believe. It's not that we can't love others if we don't love ourselves. I do not believe that, because a lot of people have trouble loving themselves and love other people beautifully. I do, however, believe that the more in love with ourselves we are, the more love we naturally have to extend to others. And it really does start from within. It all starts from how we show up for ourselves. So for me, I'm just really excited to remind people that they are worthy, they are enough, they are beautiful, they are strong, they are vital. If they did no other thing, they're all those things in this moment right
Yes.
now. You, everyone listening, you are all those things I just said right now. And if you can come to accept that, if you can open yourself up to the possibility of accepting it, be willing. If you can't love yourself right now, be willing to, and see where that willingness leads you. You are likely to notice your life changing in relation to how your relationship with yourself changes.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And that's really like mic drop material right there. So we'll just go ahead and wrap up
Drop the mic.
that. Yeah, I was like, that was so perfectly said. I don't want to even speak over it. So, how can the listener stay in touch with you, find your book, all that good stuff? This is your moment to share with them.
Thank you. Yeah, well, the book's called Enough as You Are, so you can find it on Amazon and bookstores, wherever you want to find it, I guess. And then my website is scottstabile.com. I have a Substack newsletter, which is scottstabile.substack.com. My dear friend David Gandelman and I are giving a retreat in Bali next May. I can't encourage you to come enough. It's going to be meditation, breath work, and writing as a tool for self-reflection. Becca, you have to come. I feel like
Yeah, I
I'm
know. I'm
talking to you the
like,
whole time. I'm like, this woman has to come to Bali. But anyway, so you
yeah,
can
I
find
might.
me in all the
I
normal
might.
places. Yeah. On Instagram,
That's
Facebook, you can
awesome.
find me everywhere. Yeah. And thank you so
That's
much for
great.
having me today, Becca.
Oh my gosh, it's been such an awesome and wonderful and refreshing conversation. So thank you for
Mm,
coming on the Empowered Half Hour.
my pleasure.